Yes. Oh, okay. How is that? Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the change in face of the African American church at the 21st century. And we have with us as our guest this morning, Dr. Lewis Baldwin, to talk about how the African American church has changed over the last century. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
Thank you.
And to tell you how delighted we are to have you. But as I say each time, that you've been with us so many times, and to talk about your background, your education, and your experience. I'm sure that all of our members of our audience understand who you are and the many, many, many books that you've written and your scholarship and et cetera. But for the sake of the audience, the sake of those few who might not know you, let's have you to give us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of your experiences, and then we'll get into the change in face of the African American church at the 21st century. Let's do it from that perspective.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me here first, and it's great to be here during Black History Month.
It is.
I grew up in Wilcox County, Alabama, Camden, Alabama in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Deep roots in the African American church, particularly Southern Black Baptist Protestantism. I matriculated at the public schools in Camden, Alabama in the 1950s and graduated from Camden High School in 1967. And of course, from there, I matriculated at Talladega College in Alabama, was there 4 years, ultimately receiving a BA in history from Talladega. From there to Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, where I received the MA in 1973 and the MDiv, Master of Divinity, in 1975. And from there to Northwestern University, where I was awarded the PhD in American Religion in 1980. So my educational pilgrimage has really occurred very much in connection with the Black church. Both are inseparable as far as I'm concerned, in terms of my own development.
As a matter of fact, you at one time said that your father was involved in preaching. Did you tell us that?
Yeah, that's right. My father was a pastor in Wilcox County, Alabama, or Butler County, Alabama. He also felt that his ministry related very much to civil rights. So he was a force in the black church in Alabama.
Very good. And so let's talk about the African American church, Dr. Baldwin, and to sort of start us off at the period of slavery. I mean, you know, we talk about the African American church and et cetera, but during slavery, Africans did not have an organized institution as a church. But nevertheless, they did have, speak to it from that perspective.
Exactly. In the South particularly, now you did have in the antebellum North the development of institutional black churches, but in the South, we had essentially the invisible institution of the slaves, where they met in the woods and the thickets and the ravines to worship their God and to give expression to their spirituality. So you had in the South the invisible institution, and in the North the more visible institutions in terms of the institutional church. But in the pre-Civil War years, we know that black religion developed along both lines. But after the Civil War, you get, with the Emancipation Proclamation, you get the freedom of African Americans in the South, and then institutional church developments began to occur throughout the country. So since the period of Reconstruction, I think we can speak of the black church as a national phenomenon, spilling over into the North and the South. And that institution, of course, has taken on structural form and also a sense of mission since the Reconstruction period.
And so the African American church that we're going to talk about today has a changed face in the 21st century. Why don't you, and I guess we're getting ready for our second commercial break, but when we come back, what I'd like for you to do is to look at the face of the African American church before it changed, and use this 8-minute segment to talk about that church, and then after the second commercial break, to talk about the second African American church, using all of the scholarship and individuals and et cetera within the framework of both of those churches. And so we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.
And how scholars today are viewing the church.
And we'll do that during the last 10 minutes. And so that'll give you an opportunity to use names, associate some names and activities and et cetera with that area. And then after this second break, then we'll come back and we'll deal with that last part for the last 10 minutes.
You
ready? Yes, ma'am. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for the morning. The topic is the changing face of the African American church in the 21st century. And the guest is Dr. Lewis Baldwin. And Dr. Baldwin, let us see if we can pick up at this point and to talk about the African American church before it changed during the 21st century.
Now, we know about that church largely through the scholarship of some of the pioneers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter Woodson, Benjamin E. Mays and Joseph Nicholson and E. Franklin Frazier. Now, Du Bois published the first history of the Negro church in 1903, and it used the tools of social sciences to critique the black church. Du Bois looked at the black church as a social institution, and I think his scholarship had a great influence on those scholars who came after him. Du Bois publishing the Negro Church in 1903, Carter Woodson comes along in 1921, publishes a book on the history of the Negro Church, and in 1933, Benjamin Mays and Joseph Nicholson published the Negroes Church, and in 1963, of course, E. Franklin Frazier published the Negro Church in America. And they all were concerned about how the black church functioned as a social institution. that black people could go to these institutions to feel a sense of racial unity, to feel a sense of their own personhood, to develop some sense of mission in these churches. But the argument in that first, among those first group of scholars in the 20th century was the black church, that the black church was essentially social. Of course, Du Bois and Carter and E. Franklin Frazier were sociologists. Carter Woodson was a historian. E. Franklin Frazier was a sociologist. So we can understand that the stress at that time was on the black church as a social institution and how it met the needs of black people. But there was that critique among these scholars also that the black church had not done enough to address the social, economic, and political problems confronted by blacks. So this scholarship occurred during that period of the traditional black church. We can talk about the new black church later. But the argument also focused around this question of just how involved the church was in civil rights activism. You take people like E. Franklin Frazier and W.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, they felt that the church had much to be desired in terms of its activism, that it was primarily responding to the religious needs of the people and not really responding appropriately to the social, economic, and political needs of the people. So that was an argument during that time, and we know that the life of the black church in the first half of the century, and perhaps certainly in the first half of the century, of course, proved that, because you had a kind of de-radicalization of the black church in that period from 1890 up to 1955. And Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., came along in 1955 with the involvement of the church in the Montgomery bus boycott. And of course, we noticed the radicalization of the black church.
And the change in faces.
Exactly.
It's moving away from a social organization.
Yes.
Now it's more a political, it's becoming a political organization.
Exactly. More of a political organization, more of an organization that is involved in the total needs of the black community, particularly economic, social, political. And of course, the civil rights movement had a great impact on the changing face of the black church. That was one point at which the face of the black church changed, because Dr. King made the church relevant in the struggle for civil rights. He drew on the prophetic tradition of the black church and applied that in his civil rights campaigns. So that was very, very important in the mid-1950s. So we see a different church from that we recognized in the period from Reconstruction up to 1955 when the Montgomery bus boycott started.
And so in a real sense, the church, while it changed, how did people react, did African Americans react to the change in face of this church?
I think the African Americans on the whole, particularly those who were church connected, reacted quite well, because what Dr. King did and others who were involved in his Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the 1950s and 60s, they made Gandhi relevant, because many of Gandhi's ideas coincide very much with New Testament ideas in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. So Dr. King and others in the South in the black church had already been exposed to the New Testament teachings of Jesus, so that made them more receptive to the teachings of Mohandas K. Gandhi. So I would say that African Americans responded well to this changing face of the black church from the mid-1950s up, when Dr. King drew on the church as a kind of social and political platform, as a de facto platform for the civil rights movement. Black Americans responded quite well.
Very good. And so in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin, that the church, while it might not have been a political, economic, and social organization in the first instance, it still had to deal with social, political, and economic issues.
Problems, yeah.
And how did this church deal with social, and for example, during this period, lynching might have been a very, very important consideration. The KKK and all other kinds of organizations.
Exactly.
How did this first church respond to?
Well, it depends on who you read. If you read, for an example, Gayrard S. Wilmore, who's written a very important work on African American religion, he argues that during the slavery period, the black church was very radical with people like Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, and others. He argues that the period from 1890 to 1955 was a period of de-radicalization. So he makes that argument. But if you look at E. Franklin Frazier, he argues that the black church from the slave period up to the civil rights movement had a predominantly otherworldly outlook and was not so much concerned about the issues and concerns of this world.
But the last statement in reference to that was that the black church might have responded to how society that it was in would anticipate it responding to. In other words, they could not do political things primarily because the society that they were in did not allow for political things. You know
I think that happened with most churches. Gayrard Wilmore argued that most churches up to 1955 were Booker Wright churches.
Okay, well, hold it and hold that thought, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. You know,
we talked about the traditional, now the mega church, the new black church.
American new black church, and how it responds.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was thinking, you know, when Nat Turner and others, as a matter of fact, after slavery, the African American church almost had to be concerned only in religion.
Exactly.
Because outside of that, you know, the Klan and all those other radical groups that wish to hold the Negro down. And of course, anybody who started talking about anything about voting and whatever in a church.
And the beat back advances in the South.
That's right.
You know, so that's why I say the King represented one aspect of the changing of the black church, and the 21st century represents another.
Very good. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's given us some information in reference to the change in face of the African American church in the 21st century. And Doctor, I think you've already indicated how the church faced the earlier century, immediately after slavery, et cetera. But now this church in the 21st century is a different church, and it has a different face. What made this church so much different?
Let me begin by saying that my view is that the slave church represented the radicalized black church. The church from 1890 to 1955, during Reconstruction up to the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, represented a kind of de-radicalized black church. The Civil Rights Movement re-radicalized the black church. But since that particular time, the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 particularly, we've seen a different kind of developing trend in the black church, and it has to do with the rise of mega churches and super mega churches. You look at mega churches being 2,000 to 5,000 members, maybe 7,000, but when you talk about super mega churches, you're talking about in the range of 35,000 members. And we see now what scholars call a new black church. It's called the mega church, the super mega churches, led by figures like T.D. Jakes and Creflo Dollar, the late Eddie Long. And these leaders are really considered not only religious leaders, but entrepreneurs, because these churches, when you talk about the 25,000 members to 35,000 members range, you're talking about institutions.
That's right, you're talking about some large churches.
And scholars like Anthony Penn and Paula McGee and others are talking about this new black church phenomenon, which means that these mega churches are preaching personal enrichment, a gospel of materialism, that God wants you to have this, and if God wants you to have this, you're going to have it. It's a prosperity gospel. So that's what the new black church of the 21st century is all about. And when you look at T.D. Jakes and Creflo Dollar and others, they are actually defining how we do church in the 21st century, because many preachers throughout the country in black churches are patterning their messages after Dollar and Jakes and others in these mega churches. They're beginning to pattern their liturgical styles after these churches, and of course their messages. They are messages of Christian materialism. God wants you to have this. If you can believe it, you can achieve it. So this is what is happening with the new black church today. And Paula McGee has talked about that in a book that is forthcoming on new theology, new black church theology. And Anthony Penn at Rice University has written about that. And Sandra Barnes at Vanderbilt University, all writing about the emergence of this new black church phenomenon. And what they are saying is that the black church is being redefined. Redefined. You talk about the traditional black church, but when you talk about the black church of the 21st century, it's a new black church. It's being redefined in terms of its mission priorities, in terms of its identity, in terms of its mission outreach, and at so many other levels.
Social activism and all of those kind of things, I would imagine, that would play a significant role in the difference between. Now, this new black church does not have the same pressure, outside pressure, on it as the earlier face of the African American church, which is to say that these new churches are not intimidated by racism or clans or anything else, that they are basically free in reference to parts of the of what they can do. Is that what we're saying?
That's true in a sense, but most of the scholarship argues that the new black church is less prophetic than the church that existed during the era of Martin Luther King Jr. Because Martin Luther King Jr. preached a social gospel and made the church relevant to that gospel. He was concerned about how the gospel contributed to a sense of social action, how it contributed to the creation of a particular ethical ideal. And what we find in contemporary churches, the mega churches, the new black church, of course, is an emphasis on spiritual enrichment, personal salvation, but not that prophetic dimension that Dr. King brought to the church. That's what's missing, I think, in this new black church, this mega church, the super mega churches like Potter's House in Dallas, led by Dr. T.D. Jakes. Dr. King was concerned about how the church should be, how the church could be a voice of conscience, how it could be put to the service of bringing about social, economic, and political change through demonstrations and marches and other forms of direct action, nonviolent direct action. But you don't see that today with the new black church, the mega church and the super mega church.
And so would you say that this new church is more a church of African-American nationalism, that is black nationalism, than perhaps the earlier church had been?
I would say individualism, because the earlier traditions in the black church encouraged a kind of communal consciousness, the idea that the black community as a whole was one and that they had to struggle for the liberation of the black community. But today there's so much emphasis on individual salvation, so much emphasis on personal enrichment, so much emphasis on how I might improve my own situation. But I think the church during Martin Luther King Jr. era was put to the service of a communal revolution. That is, all people had to benefit from the changes that occurred in society. So you had the movement from the slave church, which was radicalized, to the church between 1890 and 1955 that was de-radicalized, from the church from 1955 to roughly 1968, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., re-radicalized, and what we see since the death of King in 1968 through the 70s, 80s, 90s, up to the present, of course, is the rise of the mega church phenomenon, super mega churches, which are not very prophetic. Churches that are very important in black life, but are not in the sense that they were in the time of Martin Luther King Jr.
These are the churches, for example, that will talk about the African-American economic situation within the church.
Exactly.
And by using the members of that particular church, able to, in a real sense, put forth some of the economic doctrines that having houses and other kinds of things that you wouldn't ordinarily think that a church would have.
Exactly.
But because they do have such a large membership, they can afford to become involved in renting cars and et cetera, et cetera. Is that what we're saying?
And building homes for the elderly and that kind of thing. But what we see today, of course, with this new black church is, I think, a retreat from civil rights activism, prophetic civil rights activism. And I think that, of course, is a serious problem.
It is.
And also what we see, a developing trend, is that young people are so alienated from the church today. And I think C. Eric Lincoln and Lance Mamiya pointed that out in 1990 in a study on black religion and the African American churches. That is, for the first time in our history, we are seeing more African American young people who not only do not know anything about the church, but they have no respect for the church.
And don't attend.
And they don't attend the church. So that is a developing trend in the 21st century also. And then you have the dying phenomenon of the neighborhood church. Churches are moving out of neighborhood into other communities. And of course, that is another trend, I think, that is defining the new black church of the 21st century.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, we're coming to the end of this show. And I think that the information that you've given sets up a good contrast between these two churches. And I think that our audience has some idea in terms of where they stand within these churches, you know, and so I want to thank you for that. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.